A massive artillery duel and a charge led by Virginians across an open ground right beside the North Carolinians. A young man that ends up losing his brother in the fight, and Lewis Armistead at the head of those units. Sounds an awful lot like Gettysburg, but it's not. We'll take you to Malvern Hill today, tell you the story that unfolds here with the 9th Virginia at the base of Malvern Hill. The fields directly behind me here is the open ground of Malvern Hill. This is the location that we're going to walk today and talk about the 9th Virginia as they came across these fields. And we're going to use a description, a recounting of the fight that happened here from a man that was in the 14th Virginia as he was coming across these fields. And that letter was later found. And it was the most detailed letter that I've ever seen about the fight that happened out here from a man with the last name of Finley. And he wrote back home to his wife talking about what they had to do here to survive the fight on that open field. And as he described it, this entire field here was corn and wheat and oats. It must have been an amazing sight when they stepped out from the tree line way across that field over there. And as he described it, a field that was a mile away from the cannons. The cannons that were placed right here at the top of this hill called Malvern Hill. This is the end of the 7 days battles. And the fight here was terrible. Spring of 1862 would see General McClellan starting his Peninsula Campaign down off the coast of Virginia. He would push his troops up into Yorktown and start the fighting against Johnson, and would push the Confederates all the way back here to the outskirts of Richmond. It seemed that McClellan was going to take Richmond, but at the Battle of Seven Pines, an injury would bring Robert E. Lee to the table. Robert E. Lee, being an advisor up until that point, ends up taking field command and takes over for Johnson. Lee immediately begins to become an aggressive commander, and he fights and doggedly pursues the Union Army all the way to the James River in a series of battles that would become known as the 7 Days Battles. Here at Malvern Hill, at July 1st of 1862, this would be the last battle of the 7 days, as a Peninsula Campaign would come to an abrupt end, and McClellan would put his men on boats and send them back down the river that they so hardly fought for up here to Richmond. That campaign would effectively be over, as the soldiers would have to leave the peninsula and move on to other locations. That last day in June, Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army are fighting the Union forces in Glendale. And that's off in that direction, only a few miles from where I'm at right now. And they were beating them back on their heels. The Union soldiers and their commanders would have to fall back again after day of being doggedly pursued. And for some reason, George B. McClellan would cede the ground again and move back here. July 1st comes around, and we're at Malvern Hill. And McClellan really isn't in charge of the actions that are happening out here at Malvern Hill. But his forces decide this is a good place to make a stand. And all along that ridge where you see the cannons are now, this is where they place their artillery. Right now, 4 or 5 pieces maybe. Back then, 40 pieces along the ridge of this hill. And now the hill, it stretches out in this direction too. We're talking a lot of artillery, a lot of firepower. The Confederate forces get over here, and Lee sees 2 spots on the other side to place his artillery. And he orders them up. But they don't all get into play. There's only a few pieces that are actually out here on this field for the Confederates. And as the massive artillery duel starts, it's really a one-sided story. Those Union artillery pieces are blasting the Confederate soldiers on the other side from the moment that they step off to the moment that they get to right here where I'm at right now. Now, the 9th Virginia history isn't very well written, so there's not a lot of pieces that you can find out there talking about them, other than the regimental history and a few standard things on some of the soldiers that are written in books. But based on a letter from the 14th Virginia, who was in the same grouping with the 9th, we kind of know what it was like that day leading up to this fight. Finley writes to his wife and tells her that they had crossed over the lines where Longstreet's men were and had been fighting. And they got out to the position that they needed to be in, which was a thicket of woods. And as they crossed over, he knew for a fact it was Longstreet, and he saw the dogged, tired faces of the men that were there. At about 1 p.m., those cannons start to open up out here on the Confederate forces on the other side. So they're pretty much already in place. The 9th Virginia is in that grouping. Now, I'll put a map up on the screen here so you can see the positioning. If you take a look at that map, I have the 9th Virginia, which is in the rear of their unit, circled on that map. The direction of the arrow points to the direction that they're actually going up the hill. They end up bogged down around a farm, a cemetery, and some slave cabins that are on the field, which are no longer here, but we know exactly where those cabins were, so we know exactly where they were bogged down. And the description that was given comes from the 14th. And I'll tell you about that in a second. So Low Armistead is out here in charge of those groups that we're talking about that have the 9th Virginia. Low Armistead gets his dander up and decides to preemptively attack the skirmishers that are out front. Of course, fighting a skirmish line is easy. It's a small grouping of men. It's not the main line. And perhaps he didn't consider the artillery monster that was on the hill over there. But him and his men come across this field. And according to the 14th, Finley says they attacked sharpshooters near a cemetery. These sharpshooters have been laying down in a graveyard and picking people off from there. But we know that the 9th came across with Armistead. Armistead and the 9th and the rest came over here, hit skirmishers, and drove them out of these fields. They continued to press on, and they end up getting too far ahead of everybody else. Once that happens, they're bogged down. They can't go any further. They're getting picked off left and right by all of the canister fire and the cannon fire coming across the field. So they have to drop down to the ground on their faces and get behind barns, get behind cabins, hide, do anything that they can to keep themselves from being hit. Finley says in his writing that he must have had a dozen cannonballs fly over the top of his head while he was laying down. And had he been standing up, he surely would have been killed, according to him. So this is what they're facing out here on this field. So shortly after 3 p.m., Armistead and the 9th Virginia get bogged down. A part of the 9th Virginia is a young man by the name of John Vermillion. John Vermillion is a sergeant in that unit. John also has a brother named Dennis. Dennis is his second lieutenant. Both of them came from Portsmouth, Virginia. And in May of 1861, the unit that they are a part of is pulled together out there in Portsmouth. So the majority of the men that are in that unit come from the Portsmouth area. John becomes a private. His brother becomes the second lieutenant in charge of the unit. Eventually, because of how Dennis fights and earns his reputation, he becomes the company commander. And as they come out here to these fields, the two of them are in this unit fighting together coming across this area. At about 4 p.m., Magruder throws himself into the fight. With the 9th being bogged down back here, Magruder slams in right behind them, and he becomes bogged down. Then at 6 p.m., D.H. Hill throws himself into the fight. So now you've got these massive units coming across this field, trying to support each other, and the awesome artillery out there on the ridge is doing its job. It's raking the field left and right, taking out soldiers, killing anything that walks out here. Well, nighttime comes, and just before it starts to get dark, there's one final push. The 9th ends up having to get out of the way of that push. They make it just about to the cannons, and they get blasted in the face, and they have to fall back. It was a desperate situation. Now for some orientation. This ridge line here, going all the way across, is where one of the Confederate cannon units are going to be placed on that day during the fight here at Malvern Hill. This is a target, a massive target. If you take out the artillery pieces, then the Confederates can't reply to the message being sent at Malvern Hill. Off in this direction here is where, at an angle coming up in this direction, is where the 9th and Armistead and his men are coming. And they're coming off the gently rolling hills up in that direction and heading off that way. Finley describes these fields as gently rolling hills filled with corn, wheat, and possibly oats. So what you see out here today at Malvern Hill, every now and again they'll have a crop prop up over there. They'll have corn in the field. But what you see here is wild blackberry plants, and they're all over the place. And if you come out to this field, out in this bramble that's out here, you'll see lots of deer, rabbits, and other various animals popping in and out. You will also see snakes. So as you're walking across these fields, pay attention. I always come out here in a pair of boots and tick repellent and stuff like that. Try to save the hide a little bit, if you will. So now, I am at the Confederate point right now where the cannons are. We'll do a little bit of orientation here too so you can tell where we're at. The West House is way off in the distance over there, that little white spot. You can see the Union cannons if you zoom in, you can see them right there on that ridge. They're not just here, but they're across the street and they're facing that way as well. The road that runs through here on the West House branches off into Carter's Mill Road and then Willis Church Road, which goes off in that direction beyond the parsonage ruin. The parsonage ruin is just on the other side of those trees. Here, the Confederate soldiers would have cannons set up, and then off in the distance, way back here, you have Poindexter's farm. There are cannons supposed to be set up over there too. So the idea is to have converging fire from this direction and this direction to that spot right over there to try to take out those cannons, which are right out in the open. Now, they were supposed to put about 30 cannons over here to answer the 40 plus cannons that are in the field over there. It did not happen. That failure was talked about in Finley's letter. It was clear to Finley and other soldiers that there was something bungled with the cannon report, and the cannon reply was not done correctly. If the basic foot soldier on the ground can see it, then that means there was a massive miscommunication and problem out here. Out here at this position, John S. Hard of 7th South Carolina said, "Entering the field at the point where our artillery had been posted, I came upon numbers of dead and dying horses, who, with the drivers and gunners, laid in a pile together. Their several dismantled guns, their caissons fired and blown upon by enemy balls, all presenting an aspect of desolation and ruin." 7th South Carolina came out here and saw that. So even when they got out here to the field, they were still being targeted before they could get into position. And the caissons and the cannons were all being hit. But they still didn't get the guns into position like they were supposed to, which created a situation that the infantrymen were going to have to deal with coming across this field. So, coming from this artillery position, I'm going to read some excerpts from the letter that we were talking about from Finley and give you a little bit of a description of what he came into when he came out here on this field with the 14th Virginia. It'll give you a better understanding of what the 9th Virginia faced out here on this field. Lieutenant George W. Finley of the 14th Virginia said, "Next morning, our brigade was put in advance and we moved to our right, passing through the battlefield of Longstreet." He then goes on to call out the blunder from the selection of cannons that were put in place, saying that he saw Longstreet, describing the position as a grand spot to put cannons. The enemy had taken position upon a high hill, about a mile from the edge of woods where we were. Between us and them was an open field of corn and wheat or oats. We drove in there sharpshooters, lying in the clover around the graveyard. No sooner had we risen the crest of the hill than the Yankees opened fire. For 6 hours, they rained death upon us. We dashed shells and canisters, cutting our men down, all around me, confident a dozen passed over my head. Had I been standing, I must have been killed. Throwing myself flat on my stomach, I crawled on, watching the enemy's guns. While they loaded, I jumped to run towards them, and then when they fired, I laid back down. This was brave but vain valor. The nighttime, we could hear the cries of the men. Units were mixed up and mangled. Only squads could be found, and you could hear the Union retiring from the field. So based on Finley's letter, they're going off in this direction that I'm walking right now. And they're coming across this field, charging, like he said, in vain valor towards those cannons. And they get to a certain point where the 9th, John Vermillion, and Dennis Vermillion, all of them together are going to have to lay flat on their stomachs, on top of their guns, and wait and hope for a clearing to get up and go. But the clearing never really comes. At one point there is the final assault to try to push towards the guns over there, but it doesn't work out for him. But his description of nighttime out here on these fields, if you've ever been out here to Malvern Hill at night and parked over in that parking lot, you know just exactly how dark it is out here. Now imagine you're back in the 1800s. There's no street lamp over there. There are no houses with lights in them. And the night sky doesn't have airplanes or anything else other than stars, or maybe a blanket of clouds. It is pitch black out here and deafening the silence when you're out here. They're laying out here on these fields hoping that they don't get mowed down in the middle of the night. And they can hear the screams and the cries of their friends, their comrades all around them. Just a horrible noise. All of them describe it. And in the middle of the night, they're getting up and they're trying to find pieces of their units. They're trying to come back together and get reorganized because they're scattered everywhere out here. But it's almost impossible to do because it's just that dark. But then he describes hearing the Union retiring. They know they don't have a victory out here. There's too many Confederate dead on the field. Everybody can sense that this was not a victorious thing, that it was a charge that was in vain. Quite like Pickett's charge. But the next day, the end result's a little bit different than Gettysburg, because McClellan decides that night that he needs to pull his troops back, and they got to get them to the water and get them out of here. So in some aspects, this is still a Confederate victory because the Union doesn't stick around to fight. And here on this field, this is the first time in all of the 7 days that the entire Union Army is up and concentrated and ready for a fight. If there was ever a moment to take advantage of your victory and to smash your opponent, this was the time. And one can only imagine, had the Union Army really took advantage of this position, how much longer would the war have gone on? They may have broken up the Army of Northern Virginia in piecemeal. It may have been the end. Now, coming across these fields here, Captain James J. Phillips ends up saving the 9th Virginia's regimental colors. He's noted in their dispatches for his bravery for saving those colors. And that's probably about as good as it gets for the Confederate Army when it comes to awards and accolades. The Medal of Honor was created at that time by the United States for soldiers that committed brave acts on the field, to include picking up regimental colors. Had he not been fighting for the Confederate Army, that would have been something that would have been considered for him. But instead, a lot of these Confederate soldiers, the best that they could get is being mentioned in the dispatches of their officers and their generals. The highest honor of all in the Confederate Army was to be mentioned by Johnston or Robert E. Lee at that time. So now as I'm walking in the direction that those soldiers were going, they were brigaded together with the 14th, the 38th, the 53rd, and the 57th Virginia. So it's a large group of men coming across this field. In some estimates, there was about 430 men mustered in June with the 9th Virginia, and some estimates on this field place 150 men with the 9th Virginia into action here on Malvern Hill. They were organized, like I said, in May of 1861 from Portsmouth, Virginia, under Colonel David G. Godwin. Now, in a twist of fate, the 9th Virginia was organized right behind Kemper and Garnett, going across that field, Gettysburg, at Pickett's Charge. The 9th Virginia gets over that wall in Gettysburg, and Vermillion is there, right next to where Armistead goes down. But we'll talk about that in the next video coming up, when we talk about Pickett's Charge and what Vermillion did there. Now, John Vermillion's a bit of a softy. He's got a kind heart. At the age of 19, there was a massive epidemic going through Portsmouth, Virginia, around 1855. It was a fever. He comes out and lends his assistance to every single person that he can help. This is a young man who's also at risk of getting sick and dying. But he puts his life on the line to comfort and feed the sick people in Portsmouth. And he's noted for this. A lot of people talked about it. And his disposition really doesn't change throughout the war, which is probably one of the reasons why his rank really doesn't rise that far in the Confederate Army. He's a second lieutenant, and he never really musters any further. And in the regimental history, a lot of the pages don't even mention his name as one of the lieutenants in the regimental history. Now his brother Dennis ends up advancing to captain, and he ends up being the company commander of the 9th Virginia as they're coming across this field. John is out there in that unit, proudly serving with his brother. And as they come across these fields, either canister shot or cannonball tears into Dennis's chest, lays him wide open out here on the field. And the papers talk about Dennis in Portsmouth, about his bravery. He's buried in Portsmouth today. On this field, though, John didn't know that his brother was dead. He was still involved in the action because he was a foot soldier. He was a sergeant. Sergeants have a very narrow view in front of them, and it's to take care of the men that they have and to lead the ones that they can. The lieutenants and the captains have a bigger view. They're able to look around and see what's going on. They're directing these men. It's not until after John and nighttime comes that John's able to crawl across these fields, and eventually he finds his brother, and his brother is dead. It's a tragic story of a couple of brothers fighting in an army. And that happens on both sides of this war. It doesn't matter which side you're fighting for. The human aspect of this is you have two men who are brothers who are in a war together, and one of them dies. So you can imagine he's probably heartbroken by this situation, leaving Malvern Hill. And in just a little over a year from here, he would be involved in another debacle called Pickett's Charge, where he would watch people all around him die. This time he would get to the wall, and he would be repulsed at the wall. And his own general, Armistead, would fall. And he would see him fall right there, because that was what prompted the 9th Virginia to go back across that field with the few men that they had left, disorganized, back to the other side. To give you a better orientation of where we're at right now, along this ridge line here, this was the position that Finley talks about coming up over the hill. He said just as they cleared the hill, the cannons opened up on them. Dipping down over there is where they cleared out some of the skirmishers who were being driven back across this field. 9th Virginia and the units that were with them were coming across this field in this direction. And they were pushing up. And if you're off in the woods over there, you know what I'm talking about. That hill is actually a lot steeper back there than it is out here. Where I am right now is I'm on the lowest point of this field at this section of Malvern Hill. Now over here on this side, there's a lot steeper of a hill on that side. You come up and you actually don't see this portion of the hill on that side until you get to the top. So even the units that are out here in formation trying to fight together, they can't see each other across the field. Now I'm going to walk to the lowest point on this field so that you can see exactly what these cannons look like off in the distance. So we're here, and off in the distance the cannons are over there, so they're still visible. They get to this point and start making their way up this hill. And right off in the distance over here, there's a picture that's on the sign that shows the slave cabins and the house that is off in the distance that these soldiers are able to see. They get to here and they start realizing that they're taking too much fire. A lot of them make it up there to where those cabins are and that farm is. And that picture is actually taken about 100 yards off into the woods over here, going in this direction. So you can imagine the cabins and the house, which is still over here, they're all off in this direction. That's the view that they're going to have coming across this field. Now Finley talks about laying down in his face so he can avoid the cannon fire. You see the cannons over here. So if I'm a soldier, this is what it's going to look like as soon as I lay down to the ground. That's it. So looking across this field, the cannons are they're not very visible at all. The cannons are angled to fire across this field and hit the enemy as they're coming on. They're firing over my head. I'm pretty safe down here. And then Finley talks about waiting until they start to reload and then get up and run. So he sees them reloading, and he gets up from the ground, and he probably gets to right about here and has to get right back down. My camera is probably a little bit far off the ground because he's laying flat. So put yourself in the shoes of that soldier. Think about what it was like out here on this field on a hot summer day. It was only a couple of days ago. Blistering heat, sweating, and you're watching cannonballs and canister shots fly above your body. And he also describes, off in the distance to his right-hand side, he sees one of his captains blasted by a cannonball that lands squarely on the area, kills several of the men around him. They're still not protected laying down. And then getting behind a couple wooden structures isn't going to save you either. It's pretty amazing. And remember, I was telling you earlier, going past those brambles and the hill that those guys were facing on the other side of that woodlot when I gave you the orientation. This is the terrain that they're coming up. This is a steep hill. It's not like the small gentle slopes that we were on when we were walking in the wide open spaces out there. So when some of those guys are describing coming up a hill and having to lay down on their face, and then as soon as they come to the top, fire just instantly hitting them. This is what they're talking about. We got out here into the woods so that you could see this for yourself. It's pretty neat. Now at the end of the day, the casualty count out here is pretty significant. Roughly 7,700 total combined casualties. Over 5,000 of those casualties belong to the Confederate soldiers. For the 9th, they have 9 killed, 34 wounded, and 23 missing here at Malvern Hill. That's a significant loss for a group that might be about 140 total. Now, the position that I talked about earlier, with the parsonage being one of the things that are on the field out here, this is all that's left of the parsonage. It's a couple of fireplaces, stacks if you will, and a fence line that the parks put up to indicate where the parsonage actually sat out here on the field. But if you were out here July 1st of 1862, this was a perfect item for you to have, because as a general, an officer in charge, you need landscape items that you can map out and put on the path for your soldiers to go to. This is one of the locations that becomes important to the Confederate Army. D.H. Hill comes out here to this location to set up his men, and a lot of them are actually off in the woodlots over here. Now, when Finley in that letter talks about crossing over Longstreet's lines to get into position, he's coming from off in this direction over here. The Battle of Glendale took place about 3 miles off in the distance, and that's where all of these Confederate soldiers had to come from in order to prepare for the fight here at Malvern Hill. Well, I got a delay going out to Gettysburg, and I've always been one to never let that delay or obstacle get in the way of opportunity. Realizing that July was the same time frame that Malvern Hill was fought, just a year apart, I decided to come out here and tell the story on July 4th. It's an American story, but it's a story about a Confederate soldier who fought on these fields against the United States Army, and he lost his brother in combat. Now, when I get up to Gettysburg, we're going to tell the story again, but this time it's going to be about Pickett's charge and the events that took place up there with him surrounding a decision that one of his co-leaders made as they were coming across that field. It's going to wrap up this whole story, and it's going to make sense of why I talked about how nice he was. I hope you enjoyed the story, the video here on the 4th of July. I hope to have it published here shortly and put it out there for you so you can see it. Subscribe and like and hit that alert button. Until next time, this is History with Waffles.